If you're going over, I'll go with you and get a ticket at the door. We could see that there was a gauntlet situation. And I just paused a minute and was stepping forward to the end of the porch to start down the steps, and then there was a loud woman's voice behind me. And I hadn't seen anybody, I hadn't turned around. But she stepped out there and in front of us, and she looked at those men and she said, "You men ought to be ashamed of yourselves. You have no right to do this." And we stepped down the steps and came down between those lines of men in silence, except for one man who was the first one up there, spoke to me and said something to me. He'd been very mean anyway, and sort of had it in for me. I think he was a KKK member. As time went on, we became friends of lots of the people living in these houses and did things with them, and I think probably earned some of their respect. And as time went on, a lot of those people died, of course. It's been 40 years now. Hardly one of them lives here anymore. Most of them are dead. But we're still here.
Reverend McCracken, the Bromleys, and the Brokaws, how I got to know them, they had a group there called the Peacemakers that were pacifists, very militant pacifists, really acted out and lived what they believed, wouldn't pay taxes and all that kind of stuff for war. Fred Shuttlesworth, as you know, was, led the movement in Birmingham. The history of this country is different because Fred was alive. Now, not all of us can say that, but it really is. But what brought us together was that was the struggle against racism. Now, Fred and I are almost exactly the same age. I'm 66 years old, and I was born in 1924. And I was born in Louisville, Kentucky, but my family moved to Mississippi when I was quite young, and then to Alabama when I was 7. So basically, I grew up in Alabama in the 30s, basically. So I am one of those white Southerners who, and there actually were a lot more of us than people realize, who grew up in a totally racially segregated society and decided fairly young that we couldn't live in that sort of society and began to have to do something about it. I remember I won an oratorical contest when I was in high school about the Bill of Rights. And wasn't this a great country because you can go anywhere you want to, say anything you want to, and so forth. And I believed all that, and yet something wasn't right. And that I think I knew before I could put it in words that democracy wasn't for everybody. And I think that's what made her, people say what made her radical out of it, and they think I read a book by some foreign author, and I say covering the Birmingham courthouse in the late 40s, because it was just, even though I had begun to think about things some, I'd lived a really pretty sheltered life. I was growing up there in Alabama when that Scottsboro case happened and things. I didn't know any of that. I didn't know if that was going on. But in that courthouse, I saw such raw injustice every day that I walked into that place that it just began to make me sick at my stomach. And I try to explain to people sometimes, I didn't get into this to help black people. In the first place then, I didn't even know any black people, really, But because of what I saw that system doing to white people and to people I loved, my family and friends who were basically good people, but were so twisted up. They were like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that they could be good and kind, and then when their assumptions of racial privilege were challenged, they could become monsters. And I thought, what could the system ever do to somebody black as bad as what it's done to these people? It's just destroyed them. And I went through, I guess, the real turmoil of my life. Inner turmoil was that year when I first came to Louisville, because I had to rethink my whole value system. And I did, sort of, and decided I really didn't want to be a great newspaper woman after all. What I really wanted to do more than anything in the world was be a part of this movement that was changing things. And, so I got into things, and that was the late 40s, and I've been in them ever since. And so when people today say, oh, there's nothing you can do, and it's all too big to fight, well, that's just not so. You can change things, and I'm convinced of that. They say there's a great thing among some young people today, well, I'll just sort of stay out of these things, and I'll see if I can fix up my life, my backyard. You can't do that, because the world invades your backyard. Well, I think, you hear a lot today about how this generation of young people are totally uninterested in social justice questions, and all they're interested in is number one, and if they get to college, and fewer of them are getting there, by the way, because it's getting harder financially. But if they do, just get out and get a job and try to make as much money as you can. And I think that is true of a lot of young people. I think they've been conditioned toward that for 20 years, I guess. But it's not true of all of them. There's certainly a movement, you take like the school situation, where there's a strong tendency, I think, in African American communities. I know it's true here in Louisville, of a lot of people who don't think in terms necessarily of political theory and stuff, but just parents that say, gee, let's go back to segregated schools, it was better. Or even go to private schools. They're so disgusted, let's set up our own schools. It takes work. You know, I tell people, in a racist society, which is what this is, it's built on racism, any sort of communication, much less cooperation between people of color and white people, it ain't going to happen automatically. It takes working at it, it takes understanding, especially on the part of whites, to deal with their racism, our racism. And to think you can put blacks and whites in school together and not deal with the racist atmosphere meant that you were building in a failure for desegregation. Is that when African American children getting on those buses and going to school, it felt like they were going into enemy territory every day. And they were. I mean, some of the schools were better than others. A lot depended really on a principal, what sort of atmosphere they set, how many black teachers there were, whether there was a black principal, and role models and all that kind of stuff. And some of the schools are better than others. But generally it was, for many, many black students, it just has not been a good experience. To me, that doesn't mean that it couldn't work for blacks and whites to go to school together, but it can't work with racism. It can't work if it's being dominated by people who assume that blacks are inferior. They don't say that, but blacks can't learn. You know, all these racist assumptions people make, and then to think, you know, but you can't conclude from that desegregation wouldn't work. It just doesn't work when you're doing it with that attitude and those policies and whites running it. And it hurts the whites that are there. We've got parents who've come and testified at hearings, white parents whose children are in the advanced classes, and they've said it's a real dilemma for them, because if they stay in the regular classes, they're not going to get the same curriculum and educational opportunities, and yet what they're getting in that advanced class they don't like either. There'll be very few blacks, there's some, but very few blacks. They don't get to, you know, meet other people. And they get taught they're better than anybody else, which is not a lesson you want your child to learn if you got any sense, you know. So it's a dilemma, and they don't know what to do about it. And the thing I've been impressed with lately is the number of campuses across the country where there are actions that I would consider progressive by young people, and around different things. One thing is tuition going up and college becoming impossible, you know, just that sort of issue that affects them directly. Right now, the beginning of a new anti-war movement of people who don't want to go fight and die for the oil companies in the Middle East. And mainly the issue of racism. You read a lot about the racist incidents on the campuses, which are appalling. And they are going up, and I guess there's not a campus that hadn't had some horrible thing happen with racist white students attacking African American students or Latino students or whatever. In most of these places that you don't read as much about, there's a counter movement develops among certainly the African American students, but some white students too. And I think there's a growing number, I hope and I think, of white students who understand they've got to deal with this issue of racism if they're going to deal with anything else.